Dad's stomach hurts so much. The pain is unbearable. I think it's appendicitis. Can you drive over and take Dad to the emergency room? I said between gasps. I had to grip the table leg tightly to keep from passing out. What I should have heard was panic and concern from my son. But when I heard the answer, I could no longer hold on. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a glass of water, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose wrong. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to love this story. My name is Frank Miller, a retired steel welder. That night I signed the emergency surgery consent forms with trembling hands. I was not afraid of death. I was trembling because the love and care of my family, of my own flesh and blood, seemed to have run dry. It all started at 8:45 on Tuesday night. I was sitting in the living room when a terrifying pain struck. It was not a dull ache. It felt like a red-hot steel bar being driven straight into my right side. I collapsed onto the floor. After a lifetime as a welder, I was used to burns and painful workplace accidents. But this pain was on an entirely different level. My appendix was on fire. I knew I could not drive myself to the hospital. In my panic, the first face that came to mind was Brad. My son. The child I had raised with my own hands after my wife passed away. With the last of my strength, I reached for my phone. My fingers shook violently as I dialed his number. The phone rang 3 times. Brad answered. I used every ounce of strength I had left to call for help, but his response felt like a bucket of ice water thrown in my face. Dad, the hospital is close anyway. Just call an Uber. My wife and I are out walking in the park. We're also taking Zeus out so he can go to the bathroom. The weather is beautiful tonight. If we leave in the middle of it, he'll get upset and refuse to go. His voice was completely casual. On the other end of the line, I could clearly hear a television blasting at high volume. Laughter echoed from a comedy game show. The contrast was cruel. I was writhing on a cold floor while my son was enjoying a warm and pleasant evening. I froze. My ears rang. I could not believe what I had just heard. An Uber. He was telling a 69-year-old man in excruciating pain to call an Uber himself. All because a dog needed to go to the bathroom on a beautiful evening, I replied. What did you just say? I'm in terrible pain. I can't hold on much longer. I tried to emphasize every word, but Brad did not seem to care. Then just call an ambulance or an Uber XL so you'll have more room. Their service is good too. My wife and I are far from the house at the park. If we turn back now, traffic will be terrible. Just get to the hospital first. I'll stop by later and see how things are. Okay, Dad, Zeus is running now. The call disconnected. The cold, endless tone echoed through the empty house. The connection between me and my only son had just been severed in the cruelest way possible. I lay there staring at the ceiling. The physical pain was unbearable, but the pain in my chest hurt even more. Cold steel can be repaired with fire. But the heart of a father abandoned by his own child cannot be healed by any flame. Clutching my stomach, I used the last bit of strength I had left to call an ambulance myself. Alone, I stepped into the darkness of a fateful night. The ambulance siren wailed, tearing through the stillness of the night. I lay on the gurney as its wheels rattled rapidly down the hospital corridor. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling swept past my eyes, one after another. Streaks of harsh white light, cold and lonely. The strong smell of disinfectant filled my nose. It kept me awake in the cruelest way. They rushed me into the emergency room. Chaos surrounded me. Doctors' hurried footsteps echoed across the floor. Heart monitors beeped relentlessly. In the bed beside mine, an elderly couple held each other's hands tightly. The wife continuously wiped the sweat from her husband's forehead. She whispered warm words of encouragement. I turned my face away. My chest tightened. The contrast felt like a slap across the pride of a man. A young nurse hurried over to me. She was holding a clipboard with my medical records attached. Mr. Miller, you need to sign the consent form for emergency surgery. Your appendix is about to rupture. I nodded and tried to steady the pen. My hands trembled uncontrollably. These hands had once lifted steel beams weighing tons. They had endured showers of welding sparks without flinching. Yet now they were shaking because of a single sheet of paper. The nurse looked at me with sympathy in her eyes. She pointed to a blank section at the bottom of the form. Mr. Miller, please fill in the emergency contact information. We need to notify a family member right away. I froze. The black pen hovered above the paper. Out of habit, the instinct of a father for the past 20 years, I was about to write the name Brad Miller. I knew his phone number by heart. I had always believed he was the only person I could rely on in this world. But then the memory of that comedy show playing through the phone flashed through my mind. His words struck my ears again like a hammer driving in a nail. "Dad, just call an Uber." I lowered the pen. My hand went stiff. A bitter truth settled over me. If I wrote Brad's name, the doctors would call him, and he would complain again about Zeus's walk being interrupted. He would treat a call from the hospital as an inconvenience. "Mr. Miller, do you have any relatives nearby?" the nurse asked again, her voice filled with concern. I stared at the blank space on the form. It seemed enormous, just like my life at that moment. I took a deep breath, then I drew a line through the emergency contact section. I left my son's name off the form. "I have no one. Please proceed with the surgery." I spoke in a dry voice that sounded like metal scraping against metal. The nurse looked at me, her eyes filled with shock and sadness. But time was running out. They quickly wheeled me into the operating room. The anesthesia mask was placed over my face. Before drifting into unconsciousness, I made a promise to myself. I had to survive. Not because I was afraid of dying, but because I needed to wake up and see the full extent of this cruelty. The surgery went smoothly. When I opened my eyes, the clock on the hospital wall read 6:17 in the morning. The room was strangely quiet. I glanced at the small table beside my bed. My phone screen was black and silent. Not a single message. Brad still had not shown up. But just as I thought I would have to endure this lonely morning by myself, the door to my hospital room suddenly swung open. Someone rushed inside carrying a secret I never could have imagined. The hospital room door opened. The person who walked in was not Brad. It was Hank Evans, the neighbor who lived just across the narrow path from my house. Hank was wearing his familiar mechanic's jacket. Worry was etched all over his face. In his hands were a brown paper bag, still warm with steam, and a cup of coffee. "Frank, you're awake, thank God. I went over to your house and saw the ambulance had just left. I called around to every hospital I could think of before I finally found you here." Hank set the paper bag on the table. The smell of warm blueberry muffins filled the cold hospital room. It pushed away the frightening scent of disinfectants. Hank pulled up a chair and sat beside me. He did not ask pointless questions. He simply looked at my surgical incision and let out a relieved sigh. "I already spoke with the doctor. The surgery was successful. You need to rest." I looked at Hank. My throat tightened. A neighbor, practically a stranger, had spent the entire morning searching hospitals across the city just to find me. Meanwhile, my own son, the child who carried my blood, the boy I once held in my arms, had completely disappeared. "Thank you, Hank. I'm okay." My voice came out rough and strained. Deliberately, I glanced at the phone lying on the table. It remained as silent as a rusted piece of metal. No missed calls, no brief text messages. Hank followed my gaze. He understood exactly what was happening, but chose not to mention it so I would not suffer more. He patted my shoulder. "Eat a little. You need your strength back. I'll stay here with you. Do you want me to call Brad?" I shook my head. A bitter smile crossed my lips. "No need. He's busy walking his dog." Hank sighed. He did not say another word about Brad. Throughout the entire morning, he sat beside me telling stories about the machinery he was repairing at home. He called the nurse when my IV bag ran dry. The kindness of a stranger felt like a small fire warming the room. But the warmer that fire became, the colder my heart felt. It exposed the brutal reality of the relationship between my son and me. I lay in the hospital bed. The monitor showed my heartbeat had stabilized, but my heart itself was in turmoil. I kept asking myself where I had gone wrong over the last 20 years. I had worked myself to exhaustion in the steel shop. I had breathed in toxic dust and smoke for decades so I could pay for his education. I had never allowed him to go without anything he needed. Was this hospital bed and this loneliness the reward I had earned? At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Hank finally had to leave because he had customers waiting at his repair shop. The room fell into complete silence once again. The ticking of the clock sounded like hammer blows striking my nerves. I reached for my phone. I tried to convince myself that maybe Brad was busy at work. Maybe he had lost service. I turned on the screen. There were no notifications from my son. But as I absent-mindedly scrolled through a social media app, an image appeared before my eyes that caused my entire body to freeze. A display of heartless indifference so cruel that it was almost unbearable to look at. Brad's face appeared in a Facebook post. It was a photograph taken at an upscale steakhouse in downtown. The post had been uploaded at 9:47 the previous night, exactly 1 hour after I had called him during my medical emergency. Exactly when I was lying on a gurney with an appendix on the verge of rupturing. In the picture, Brad and his wife were smiling brightly. Between them sat Zeus wearing a handsome red bow around his neck. Expensive meals covered the table. Beneath the photograph was a carefully crafted caption, "Perfect family day with our most wonderful four-legged family member." I stared at the picture. My eyes burned. The sting was not from tears. It came from a truth too cruel to face. Perfect family. Those words felt like a red-hot steel rod being driven straight into my unhealed surgical wound. I was his father. I was lying alone within the white walls of a hospital room. Yet to him, a perfect family consisted only of himself, his wife, and a dog. So the story about walking the dog in a park 5 miles away had been a lie. An excuse. He did not want his luxurious evening interrupted. He did not want the smell of a hospital ruining a romantic dinner. He would rather leave his father facing death than cut short an expensive meal. I scrolled through the comments. Friends showered the post with hearts and compliments. Wonderful. What a beautiful family. So happy for you guys. Not one of them knew that somewhere else in the city the man who had given him life was signing surgical consent forms alone. I turned off the phone and tossed it onto the bedside table. The dull thud echoed through the room. I closed my eyes, but Brad's smile continued to haunt me. I had spent my entire life working in a steel fabrication shop. I had endured 12-hour shifts beneath temperatures that felt like 122 degrees Fahrenheit. I had sacrificed my youth and my health for the paychecks that went directly into his future. I believed I was building something solid for my son. I had been wrong. I had constructed a magnificent building on a rotten foundation. Pain pulsed from my surgical incision once more. But it was nothing compared to the collapse taking place inside me. I no longer felt angry. The anger had transformed into something far more frightening: coldness. When steel is heated until it glows and then plunged into cold water, it becomes exceptionally hard and brittle. My heart felt the same. It had passed beyond pain. Now, it was time to look at everything through the lens of pure reason. I opened my eyes and stared at the hospital ceiling. Darkness gradually settled over the room as evening approached. In that absolute silence, I began doing calculations. Cold calculations, calculations made with real numbers. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking what I owed my son. Instead, I began asking what my son had truly earned. I began listing the numbers. My mind was working with the precision of a machine in a steel fabrication shop. Numbers do not lie. They give betrayal a crushing weight. I mentally added up everything I had spent on Brad over the years. First, there was $6,000 for the used car he needed when he started college. Then $25,000 for his final semester tuition after his scholarship was reduced. After that came $40,000 for the lavish wedding at the elegant restaurant his wife had always dreamed of. And the largest amount of all was $60,000 for the down payment on the house they currently lived in. The total came to $133,000. $133,000. Those were not meaningless figures on paper. They were sweat. They were blood. They were overnight shifts beside suffocating furnaces. They were the health of a welder exchanged for his son's comfort and security. I had confused giving money with building a connection. I had bought him a life, but I had never bought a place in his heart. What was the value of $133,000? A cold response over the phone while his father faced a medical emergency. A flat refusal because he was busy walking a dog. Brad had accepted every dollar from me as naturally as if it were my obligation. Yet when I needed him to repay that kindness with a 15-minute drive, my worth fell below that of a pet. The truth was bitter. I realized I had raised a selfish man. I had supplied all the right materials, yet somehow produced a defective result. The structure was compromised beyond repair. A weld that is flawed deep inside cannot be fixed by painting over the surface. It has to be cut out completely. I laughed quietly to myself in the darkness. The sound echoed through the hospital room, dry and hollow. I had spent my entire life accumulating assets for him. I still had substantial savings in this house. Brad had always assumed every dollar of it would eventually become his. He was patiently waiting for my inheritance, never realizing that everything had changed. 5 days passed in the hospital. I was discharged alone in a taxi. Brad never showed up. Not once. Not even a brief message asking how I was doing. Then on the afternoon of the 5th day, just as I stepped back into my empty house, my phone suddenly rang. It was Brad. He did not ask about my surgery. He did not ask how I was feeling. The very first words out of his mouth were a request so shameless that I felt my blood begin to boil. I had just lowered myself into the old armchair in the living room. The incision in my abdomen still sent sharp pains through my body whenever I moved too quickly. Brad's voice came through the phone speaker. There was not the slightest trace of hesitation or remorse in it. He got straight to the point, as though nothing had happened during the past 5 days. "Dad, are you home already? I was planning to come visit you, but work has been crazy lately. By the way, Dad, I wanted to ask you something about that savings account you said would eventually be in my name." I tightened my grip around the phone. My knuckles turned white. I took a deep breath to keep my voice from shaking with anger. A wave of disgust rose inside me. This was my son. He knew his father had just survived a life-threatening surgery. He did not ask whether I was still in pain. He did not ask whether I was eating properly. The first thing he cared about was money. The savings account I had once promised to give him when he turned 30. "What about it?" I answered in a voice as cold as ice. On the other end of the line, Brad gave a nervous chuckle. His tone carried a hint of flattery mixed with calculation. "Oh, nothing major, Dad. My wife and I have been reviewing some financial plans for the future. You know how expensive city life has become. We have a few new projects in mind, so we just wanted to check what resources our family has available. You're still keeping that account information safe, right?" I looked out the window. The bare branches in my yard swayed in the wind. I remembered the $133,000 I had totaled up in the hospital. I remembered the photograph of his perfect family on Facebook. My heart felt like an industrial freezer. There was no warmth left inside it. "It's still safe. It's still in my safe." Brad let out an audible sigh of relief. "That's great. Keep it secure, okay? This weekend, my wife and I will bring Zeus over to visit you, and we can talk about it in more detail. I have something very important I'd like to discuss with you." Then he hung up. Slowly, I lowered the phone. A visit this weekend, I knew perfectly well he was not coming to see his old father. He was coming because he smelled money. He believed my years of silence and patience were a blank check for every demand he wanted to make. He saw me as a resource to be mined indefinitely. Brad had underestimated a steel welder. I knew how to cut away rusted sections to save an entire structure. But even I had not anticipated how shameless my son and his wife had become. What they were about to ask for would go beyond every boundary I thought possible. They were preparing to present a request so outrageous, so unbelievable, that it would shatter what remained of our relationship into 100 pieces. Saturday afternoon arrived with the sound of Brad's car pulling into the driveway. I was already sitting in my old armchair in the living room. The door opened, and Brad walked in with his wife. Zeus followed behind them. They were dressed as if they had just come from a party. Brad set a cheap fruit basket on the table. He gave me a quick glance and spoke casually. "Dad, feeling better yet? You still look a little pale." I did not answer. I simply nodded. His wife immediately sat down on the couch and pulled out her phone. Brad took a seat across from me. He never asked about the days I had spent alone in the hospital. He never apologized for that phone call on the night of my surgery. Instead, his eyes drifted toward the safe in the corner of the room before he cleared his throat and got straight to the point. "Dad, like I mentioned before, my wife and I want to move into a new house in the suburbs. Our current place is getting a little cramped." I remained silent. I wanted to see how far he would go. When he saw no reaction from me, he continued speaking with an air of urgency. "The new house has a huge backyard. You know Zeus has gotten really big lately. The old place doesn't give him enough room to run around. He gets restless and barks all night. The veterinarian said he needs more space to reduce stress. We're still short about $75,000. Do you think you could take some money out of that savings account and lend it to us?" I stared at my son. My chest tightened with a feeling of pure disgust. Numbers raced through my mind. $75,000. An enormous amount of money. And the reason so a dog could have a larger yard. Slowly I stood up, despite the pain still pulsing through my surgical incision. I looked directly into Brad's eyes. My voice dropped low, cold as hardened steel. "You're asking me for $75,000 so your dog can have a bigger yard, but you couldn't spare 15 minutes to drive your father to the emergency room." Brad froze. The color drained from his face. He hurried to defend himself. "Dad, I already explained what happened that night. We were far away and I thought the hospital was close to your house. Why are you still holding on to that? Zeus is like a child to us. Please help us this one time." That was it. Every ounce of patience I had left was gone. The final weld had broken. There was no hope left in me for this son. I looked at Brad. Then I looked at Zeus, lying peacefully on the floor, and I knew exactly what I needed to do. "I understand now. Go home. Come back next Saturday. I'll give you my answer about the money and the house." Brad's eyes lit up immediately. He thought I had softened. He thought he had won. He led his wife and Zeus back to the car with triumphant smiles on their faces. They had no idea that the moment the front door closed behind them, I picked up my phone and called someone. Someone who would help me completely change the future of that $133,000 and the future of Brad himself. If you've stayed with the story this far, then you've probably found it interesting. Please do us a small favor that takes only a moment. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you made it this far, and tell me what you think the ending of this story will be. Let's see if your prediction is correct. Many people watch without doing those things, but it costs nothing and means a great deal to us. As soon as Brad's car disappeared through the gate, I immediately called Hank. I asked him to drive me somewhere. It was the Heartland Animal Rescue on the edge of town. I had read about the place in the local newspaper a few weeks earlier. The shelter greeted me with a chorus of barking dogs. There were no pampered pets wearing red bows here. Only abandoned animals. Injured animals. Elderly animals waiting for a second chance at life. The shelter manager, Clara Sterling, came out to greet us. Her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who worked too many hours, but her smile was genuinely warm. She wore a protective work jacket covered in mud and animal fur. I spent the next hour simply watching Clara work. She personally cleaned the wounds of a 3-legged dog. She gently comforted a terrified rescue cat. Her dedication was real. There was no performance in it, no attempt to impress anyone. She cared for society's discarded creatures with her whole heart. As I watched Clara, I found myself thinking about Brad. My son was willing to spend $75,000 of his father's hard-earned money to provide more luxury for a pet. Meanwhile, the animals here struggled every day just to find food and safety. Eventually, I sat down with Clara in her small office. I got straight to the point. I asked about the legal structure of the Heartland Foundation. Then I told her what I wanted to do. "Miss Sterling, I want to create a new will. I'm going to use a life estate provision. I'll continue living in my home for the rest of my life, but when I'm gone, ownership of my house and my savings account will transfer entirely to the Heartland Foundation." Clara stared at me. She was so shocked that she dropped the pen she was holding. For a moment, she struggled to find words. Then she asked if I was absolutely certain. I nodded without hesitation. There was no doubt left in my mind. The following day, with Hank and the Foundation's attorney serving as witnesses, I signed every legal document. Unlike the night in the hospital, my welder's hands did not tremble. They were steady, firm, certain. The counterattack had been set in motion. I returned home and quietly waited for the following Saturday. The day Brad would arrive, expecting to finalize his $75,000 request. In the center of my living room table, I placed an old oak box. Inside that box was my final answer, and the future my son never saw coming. Saturday arrived once again. Brad and his wife walked into the house overflowing with confidence. They laughed and chatted, their eyes fixed on the oak box sitting on the living room table. They believed it contained the $75,000 savings account they had come to claim. But they had not come alone. Brad had invited Hank and Clara Sterling as witnesses for what he assumed would be the transfer of family assets. It was the greatest mistake of his life. "Dad, we're here. You've got everything ready, right? The sellers of the new house are already pushing us for the down payment." Brad spoke eagerly, unable to hide his impatience. I sat silently looking at the two of them with eyes as cold as hardened steel. Then I pushed the oak box across the table. "There you go. Open it." Brad hurriedly lifted the lid. The smile vanished from his face instantly. There was no money inside, no savings account documents, only a stack of old photographs, several birthday cards from when he was a child, and a thick bundle of neatly organized paperwork. Brad frowned and picked up the documents. They were detailed records of the $133,000 I had spent on him throughout the years. At the very bottom was a legal document bearing the bright red seal of an attorney. "Dad, what is this? Where's my savings account? What happened to the house and your assets?" His voice began to tremble. He flipped through the papers frantically. His wife leaned forward, her face turning pale. I cleared my throat. My voice cut through the room like steel. "My house, my savings account, and all of my assets have been legally transferred to the Heartland Animal Rescue Foundation. The paperwork was completed earlier this week. Clara Sterling is here today to receive the official documents." Brad looked as though the ground had vanished beneath his feet. He shot to his feet, eyes wide, face red with fury. In front of Hank and Clara, he shouted at me, "Have you lost your mind? You gave your entire life savings to a bunch of animals. I'm your only son. You can't do this to me. That inheritance belongs to me." I slowly stood. The presence of the steel welder I once was returned in full. I looked directly into the eyes of the son who had abandoned me. Every word struck like a hammer against an anvil. Inheritance belongs to people who know how to behave like human beings. I took a step forward. "On the night I was lying on the floor with an appendix about to rupture, what did you tell me?" The room fell silent. "You told me to call an Uber because you were busy walking your dog." My voice never rose. It did not need to. "You decided that your father's life was worth less than a pet's evening walk. If that's how little value I had to you, then today I'm giving my money to animals that have shown more loyalty than you ever did." Brad opened his mouth, but no words came out. He turned toward Hank and Clara as though searching for support. He found none. Hank stood with his arms crossed, staring at him with open contempt. Clara slowly shook her head. The truth had been exposed. Every act of selfishness, every moment of indifference, every excuse, all of it now stood naked before witnesses. Brad's wife covered her face and began sobbing. Brad remained frozen in place, trembling as the reality finally sank in. Everything he thought was waiting for him was gone. The revenge was neither loud nor cruel. It was legal, final, and devastating. A direct blow against the greed that had consumed them. Eventually they gathered their things and stormed out of my house in humiliation. The front door slammed behind them. Silence returned. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. I looked down at the empty oak box resting on the table. The greatest burden of my life had finally been lifted. But my story was not over. Several weeks later, I set out to find a very special visitor. I carried with me a long overdue gift from the past. And that journey would teach me the final lesson about what real love truly means. I returned to the Heartland Rescue Center. This time, I was not there to sign paperwork. I was there to find a friend. I adopted Rusty, an old abandoned dog whose fur had faded to the color of rusted steel. Rusty had sad eyes but a fiercely loyal heart. He was too old for endless running and mischief. He preferred to lie quietly beside my armchair, watching me read books or listen to music. Rusty's silence brought me a strange sense of peace. It felt like a connection between two aging souls that had weathered many storms. One late afternoon, a letter appeared in my mailbox. It was from Brad. His handwriting was shaky, filled with belated regret. He wrote that he and his wife had been forced to sell their luxury car to pay off debts. He apologized for his indifference on that terrible night. He begged me to give him a chance to start over. After reading the letter, I quietly folded it. Then I placed it inside the old oak box. I no longer hated Brad, but I also knew I would never return to the broken structure we once had. When a weld has completely failed, it should not be patched together with words alone. I looked out across the sunlit yard. Rusty lay peacefully at my feet, and there, in the later years of my life, I finally understood the greatest lesson I had ever learned. Love is not a bank account that grows through deposits. Love is presence. Do not wait until you are alone in a hospital bed to discover who truly loves you. Love is not measured by words. It is measured by whether someone shows up when you need them most. Life is painfully short. Give your appreciation to those who deserve it. Do not allow your kindness to be exploited by selfish people, even if they share your blood. Thank you for spending this story with Dad's real-life revenge. If you enjoyed it, please join our community by liking and subscribing for more powerful and emotional family stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this space.